I was just sitting there like, I mean, it's kind of hot though. Good evening, everyone. My name is Celeste Cover. Welcome back to the channel. Okay, so before we go ahead and get started with the review, I wanted to throw out a couple disclaimers. The first being that there will be discussions of some amount of sexual violence, so if that is particularly hard for you, feel free to give this one a skip. The second being that I am going to spoil the shit out of this, so if you have not seen the film and you want to remain pure, go ahead and add this video to your watch later playlist. Go see the film in theaters and come back and watch the video once you've seen the film. The next is that I have probably titled this video something a little bit clickbaity, like that it was really disappointing to me, or that I think the film is a disappointment, and while that is true, I still really like the film. To spoil my score, I did give this a 7 out of 10, and there is a lot that I like about it. There's just a lot of ways in which I wish I had gotten more from it. So I'm going to be exploring those things, but I'm also going to be exploring the things that I liked. So if you're like a big Nosferatu head fucking Dracula freak or whatever, I'm not just going to be shitting on this. So I would just ask that you hear me out before you click away and click the dislike button. But if you want to leave me a nasty comment, I guess go ahead, because it just helps with engagement. So my last little thing before we bite into the heart of the analysis is that if you are at all a fan of in-depth discussions on cult and art house films, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button, click the like button, and leave me lovely comments to read. If you want to support this venture monetarily, I also have a Patreon where you can get a shout out at the end of my next video, have access to 3 exclusive videos per month, access to our inclusive and kind and lovely Discord server, and handmade, hand-stamped, wax-sealed postcards from me to the highest tier. So if you want to support me and my ventures, that is greatly appreciated, and the link is in the description. Okay, I've held you up long enough on your journey to the analysis. Castle. Okay. Let's go ahead and start with a quick plot synopsis just to make sure that we're all on the same page here. Okay, so the film opens with Ellen as a young girl, begging for a spiritual being to hear her call. Count Orlok answers her call in what appears to be a horrific assault. Years later, she is married to Thomas Hutter. Hutter is asked by his boss to travel to Orlok's castle to sign the deed to an old decrepit house near his. After a long journey, he arrives and Orlok quickly feeds on him. Hutter opens Orlok's coffin trying to kill him, but Orlok awakes. He runs away and Orlok boards a ship to go to Ellen, bringing a plague with him. Orlok begins a reign of terror and gives Ellen an ultimatum to either choose to be with him forever or he will kill Hutter. After Hutter arrives back and Ellen confesses her relationship to Orlok, Hutter enlists the help of Professor von Franz, an expert in the supernatural and the occult, to kill Orlok. Von Franz and Ellen both realize that the only way to kill Orlok is for her to sacrifice herself. She tells Orlok she has chosen him, and he feeds on her until sunrise, which kills him. She dies right before Hutter arrives, and he weeps over her body, and the film ends. Okay, so maybe another quick disclaimer I want to give is that I am like literally the exact target audience for this film, and possibly the easiest mark possible to love it. I mean, look at me. But also, before this film, I was pretty sure that Robert Eggers was my favorite contemporary director. I think that all 3 of his films previous were all like perfect or near perfect. I do kind of prefer them in the order that they came out, but I didn't think he was getting worse or anything. The Witch is one of my favorite films of all time and speaks to my own personal sensibilities the most, and The Lighthouse is just incredible. And even The Northman, like, despite it having a larger budget and kind of marketing itself towards a more mainstream audience, is still very kind of weird and artsy, and it's just filled to the brim with Eggers isms, as it were. And so I felt that he always kept his indelible sort of stamp on anything that he creates, and that for this to be a project that he was so invested in, I felt confident that he had a vision in mind for this story that would differentiate it enough such that it was worth the like decade plus he put into creating it. I should also say that like when I first heard murmurings of this, or that like it was confirmed to be happening, when Anya Taylor-Joy was attached to the cast, and at least I had first heard of it in 2020. I think it might have even been 2019, and then, you know, it just went through development hell, and like so many times it was like canceled, or he was like, I just don't know if this can happen, and then eventually it was like, I saw a trailer and it was like, this is for real happening. And I was like, this is going to be amazing. This is going to make me come. This is going to be like the greatest theater experience of my life. I just had expectations through the roof. You know, waiting like 5 years like that for a film from your favorite contemporary director, like that is a really high bar to clear. But I kind of felt confident that he could do it. And then, you know, I watched it opening day. I watched it at 10 p.m. Christmas Day. I abandoned my family to go to my hometown's sort of actually pretty nice theater, where all the other freaks kind of emerged from the shadows, and I got a pretty much a perfect seat in a really nice theater on a big screen. And I did have a good time, but I walked out of there being like, just knowing that I felt disappointed that it didn't live up to my expectations, but not being able to really put my finger on why. And then I gave it a few days and I thought about it some more. And then I thought, you know, I really should see this again now that my expectations are out of the way and I know what to expect. And I went to go see it with my friend. And honestly, there are parts about it that I liked more, and there are parts about it that I liked less, but ultimately I landed on the same rating, and, you know, ultimately, I have... I've not been able to stop thinking about this film. Like, my social media feeds are still pretty much entirely Nosferatu content, because, like, the circles that I run in are, like, the algorithm is quite sure that I want to see that, and they're not wrong. There's some good Nosferatu content out there, but I just can't seem to escape it yet. I feel like I'm starting to hit the point where I'm rambling, so let's go ahead and pivot to the section of the review where I talk about the things that I liked about the film, because there are quite a few things that I liked. The first thing that is immediately obvious as you're watching it, and like the thing that kept me going the first time that I saw it in a really nice theater, was how beautiful the film looks. The aesthetic and the color palette and the cinematography are all so gorgeous, and the production design and the costumes, all of it is so good. And I'm going to talk about ways in which I wish he leaned harder into this, but it does still feel like a Robert Eggers film. Like, his kind of trademark historical accuracy to an almost fetishistic degree is still present, and, you know, there's clearly a ton of care and love put into every frame in the film, and like not a dollar was wasted. Like, all of that budget went into how gorgeous this thing looks. Speaking about the color palette, I love how monochromatic it is. Like, I've heard people describe it as like a black and white film in color, and I think that that's true, but it also, you know, after rewatching the original, a lot of silent era films, especially in the German Expressionist era and movement, would have sections that have like where the film cells are tinted certain colors to create a certain atmosphere or to produce a certain effect in regards to lighting or what time of day it is. In the ways in which there's so many, like, the monochromatic color palette kind of flips between like entirely cold blues and then like warm browns and like a bronze sort of color. It really kind of works in recalling the ways in which silent films would tell us whether or not we were watching something during the night or during the day. So that felt like a really nice nod to the original to me. I also really appreciate, and I think it's really cool, how the nature of the Victorian era itself kind of allows Eggers to not compromise on his ultra-authentic historical style, while also remaining like his most accessible film yet, which I think is clear by how well it's performing. The Victorian era, both in its language and its historical proximity, is kind of close enough to the current day such that there's not a lot of moments where it's hard to tell what is being said, as opposed to like The Lighthouse, which is a real challenge to understand without subtitles, as I learned the hard way seeing it in theaters. Next thing I love is the look and the sound of Count Orlok, the character, and Bill Skarsgård's kind of depiction of him, but also just the makeup and the costume and the way that he's shot. This might be a little bit controversial because I've seen a lot of people refer to him as like the most monstrous version of the character, or like he is like a monster. And I think that that's true when he's like fully naked, or he's like, you know, you can see his back with all the like holes and shit in it, and like his like fucked up legs and shit, you know. He definitely looks like some kind of fairy tale or fantasy creature. But when you just see his face, or when he's in his cloak and he's kind of shrouded in shadow, I think of all the iterations of Nosferatu, I think he looks the most like an actual person. Because like one thing that makes it difficult for me to suspend disbelief in the previous adaptation, and this is particularly true in the Herzog version, there's always the scene where Hutter or Jonathan Harker, depending on which version you're watching, sees or meets Nosferatu for the first time. And like, especially in the Herzog version, like when this fucking dude shows up and you see him, I'm just like, absolutely not. Like, if I fucking rolled up to somebody's house and they looked like that, I'd be like, oh, this is not like a person. This is like some kind of horrible, like spectral, like monstrous creature that I've happened upon, and I need to turn around now. It's like crazy to watch them like treat him like a normal person. But in this one, like I do see it. Like he's intimidating and he's weird looking and he's got the fucking fingernails and everything. But like I can see seeing this person, especially in all his like garb and dim lighting, and being like, okay, this dude's weird as fuck and he's skeeving me out, but like I'm not in doubt that this is a person, right? And then I wasn't sure about it the first time I saw it, but I actually really like the mustache, and I think the voice is really impressive and fun, even though it's a little bit much. I like it. When I first heard it, I thought for sure like there had to be some kind of digital alteration happening to his voice, but you know, I've read that he really just trained with like a professional opera singer, and like as somebody who does vocals and does singing myself, like in my experience anyway, it's actually harder to lower your range than it is to get it higher. The lows that he's able to get to, and like the timbre of his voice is really quite impressive. And I think everybody was kind of thrown by the mustache at first, but I love reading Robert Eggers' like take on it. He's like, absolutely not. Of course there's going to hate. Of course he's going to have a mustache. Like, read anything about the people of this time, and like they had fucking mustaches. Just pull up Vlad the Impaler if you're still confused, right? And the last positive that I want to highlight is that I think the performances are really great, like pretty much across the board, but Lily Rose Depp is getting a lot of attention. I think rightfully so. Like, I think her performance is really bold and interesting and unique and very vulnerable, but I really want to say that I think Nicholas Hoult is the MVP here. Like, he gives the most kind of grounded, realistic performance, I think, while also selling me the most on the emotions that he's feeling, especially in that scene where he is just terrified and like panicking as Count Orlok comes up to bite him. Like, I felt it. Like, in the just sitting in my seat, I felt that fear with him. He sells being afraid really well. He also plays the like kind of bitter, like uncomfortable, sort of insecure cuck really well. You can just see it in his face in some of these scenes, and I don't know, I just thought his performance was really impressive the whole time. Okay, so now that that part's out of the way, let's get to the hard part. Let's talk about the criticisms that I have of the film. The first one, and the one that feels the most obvious and that I can't seem to get away from, is just like, why does this exist? Like, as opposed to watching a sort of fresh or unique take on the film, either from a story perspective or thematically, I feel like I'm really just watching like a greatest hits compilation of the original Murnau film, the Herzog adaptation, Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, and then like throw in a weird scene from The Exorcist. Okay, like the visual style is certainly unique. The I guess dedication to period accurate everything is unique, but I don't know that it is enough to justify it existing. Like, first of all, like, Lily Rose Depp is quite literally dressed like Isabelle Adjani in Nosferatu the Vampire, which I feel like is a mistake, because that is like to me personally, is like the highest possible bar to clear. Like, I think Isabelle Adjani in that film is maybe the most gorgeous and aesthetically perfect anybody has ever looked on screen. And there are shots where like I'm literally forgetting which film I'm watching, and I'm just like, wow, that's just straight from all these other films. Especially there are a few shots of Lily Rose Depp where you can't really see her face, where I'm like, what the fuck? Well, how is Isabelle Adjani in this film? I guess it really is just kind of disheartening to see Eggers kind of abandon his, I think, really fierce and unique originality for what is ultimately just like a straightforward remake of a film that's already been remade a number of times. You know, between strictly Nosferatu remakes and Dracula remakes, which is pretty much what Nosferatu is. Like, you've seen this, like, as long as it's sort of being true to the narrative, like Nosferatu and Dracula are almost the same story. So it just feels kind of exhausting watching the same thing from somebody who I know could have swung bolder and could have gone harder and chose not to in order to stay true to the source material. It really just kind of feels like the film exists solely for Eggers to get this out of his system. Like, I know that this was a very personal project for him, and the original Nosferatu like a very personal film for him. And like, I don't know, I feel like this is just something that he couldn't get away from, that he just had to do. I'm hearing murmurings that he's going to be doing a Labyrinth remake, and I've also seen that he's done a script about a medieval knight, which I would just love to see. Also a Western, like, yes, let's give me Eggers' weird, fucking bizarro, depraved, feminist lens on all the different genres, please. But I am not looking forward to the prospect of a Labyrinth remake. Unless he wants to get real weird with it, in which case I'd be in favor of it. I don't want to go as far as to say like this is his sellout movie, but it feels like it's approaching that. And I just thought for sure that if he had had this project at the forefront of his mind and heart for like a decade, that was because he had a new take or a vision on this story that I couldn't predict, but that like I trusted that he would guide me to. And I don't know, again, aside from the visuals, which are very nice, I struggle to find a reason to return to this over, I'm going to keep referencing these films, so bear with me, over the Herzog or the Coppola adaptations of this story. The next criticism that I have is going to be the most subjective and the most like, I understand that I just wanted something different, but this isn't horny enough. Just straight up, it isn't weird or depraved or horny enough. It just isn't. I'm seeing a lot of posts going around that this is like for the real freaks, for the real perverts, and I'm just like, I guess. Like in terms of like the standards for film in the 2020s, for how sexless and how like kind of normie sexuality has to be to get portrayed in like a multiplex or whatever, like I get it. For a lot of people this probably is like the most depraved sick shit they've seen like in theaters in a long time, it maybe ever, but like I feel like we just could have gone so much harder, and we really should have, you know? Some of the parts are like sufficiently horny or like really gay or depraved or queer, and like these were the parts that I liked the most. I loved all of the feeding scenes, like the sound design is just really uncomfortable and like really at the forefront, like his like slurping and gulping noises are just really at the forefront of the sound design. It was fun. The first time seeing this, when he's like on top of Nicholas Holt's character, just sucking out of his chest and taking deep gulps of all of his blood. Like there was this group of people behind me who were whispering the whole time, and it was driving me insane. But during this part, I could actively hear them like go ugh or like gag and like kind of recoil, and I almost like laughed out loud because I was just sitting there like, I mean, it's kind of hot though. Like, can we be adults? Can we be honest and that this is really hot? Please. And then the scene where Ellen kind of like gives in to her most like primal and base desires and dares Hutter to fuck her as good as Orlok could is probably my favorite scene in the film, because like that is something that is unique to this adaptation. It is surprising, it is daring, and it is uncomfortable, and like it is like questionable what is happening there like ethically, and like what we're supposed to take from that, or like where their characters are at. And like that's the part where you can see Hutter's masculinity be challenged the most, and like Nicholas Holt's performance like really shines through. Yeah, that was a good scene. So I mean, Eggers has said that he set out to make the least horny adaptation of Dracula. And while I don't actually think he succeeded in that, like it is still pretty horny. That's clearly a large part of the disconnect here. Like we obviously find different aspects of this story interesting and exciting, and I guess that's okay, but I'm just like, what are you doing making vampire movies if you're not going to get horny with it? Like Loki, what's going on there, you know? Okay, so the next and probably the biggest thing I want to talk about, like my primary critique of this film, is simply what the fuck is this movie about? And I don't mean like strictly from a plot perspective. It's Dracula, like we know this, right? But in terms of what it is attempting to say thematically, or what message it's trying to put forth, or what comment it's trying to make on, maybe not overtly political things, though I think that's in there as well, but in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, in terms of depression, death, all these themes that are clearly present in the film, I'm still struggling to figure out what exactly it wants to say about them, and I'm not sure that the film knows either. So whenever you're talking about Dracula, and you're talking about a faithful adaptation of Dracula, you're going to necessarily come up against the inherent sort of reactionary nature of the source text, Bram Stoker's Dracula, the novel, is a fairly regressive reactionary text. It is clearly a book about the anxieties relating to female sexual liberation and female sexuality in general, and it positions like the embracing of female sexuality as like a literal plague that is brought upon Victorian society, and you know, Christianity, heterosexuality, etc. are positioned as the heroes of the story to save women specifically from the evils of their own sexuality. Now, I know that that's just one read of the text, but I think that that's pretty uncontroversial. And those are the themes you are going to come up against if you try to adapt this work. Now, there's also things about it that are not reactionary and that we can latch onto from a more progressive lens and a more deviant lens, if we so choose. There's obviously a very queer subtext throughout the novel, and sexuality in general, and the kind of lascivious sort of attractiveness of Dracula as a character is inherent in the text and can be explored and reclaimed for sure. I'm not going to doubt that at all. But if you're striving for authenticity, you're going to run into this problem. If the goal is not to make a straightforwardly reactionary film, which I don't think was the goal here. Like, I think that Eggers thinks that he is sort of remixing the themes a little bit to be more progressive, particularly in regards to how it portrays hysteria and repressed sexuality. I'm thinking of the scenes in which they try to treat Ellen's kind of condition and do so by drugging her and tying her to the bed and basically stripping her of her autonomy, and how Willem Dafoe's character kind of has to come in and be like, hey, fucking cut it out, you know? So while I think we're attempting to grasp at some progressive ideas here by making so much of the subtext in the story textual and staying faithful to the story to such a degree, like, I think the reactionary politics of the story are only made more obvious as opposed to made more fuzzy and made such that the audience can kind of interpret it in their own way. That kind of brings me to why I feel like other adaptations of this get a pass on this sort of reactionary nature of the text. We're talking about Bela Lugosi's Dracula, like that is pretty far removed textually from the original novel, and you just kind of have this incredible symbol of like attractive sexuality. My patron saint Bela Lugosi stays with me always. But let's talk about, as another point of comparison, let's talk about Bram Stoker's Dracula from Francis Ford Coppola and the Herzog, our sort of North Star of Dracula adaptations for me personally. Coppola, I think, gets a pass because he is sort of the first to explicitly attempt to adapt the novel strictly. And so that's what you're going to get. The themes of the novel are inherent to it and are going to be inherent to a strict adaptation. And so if that's the project, then it is what it is, right? And there's other things that we can latch onto, and I do think that Coppola still manages to subvert and sort of emphasize the aspects of the story that I think hold up today. Like Gary Oldman's portrayal is just very romantic, and there's a lot of really depraved sexuality throughout that film. So it's a good one. And Herzog, I feel like Herzog trusts the audience to know this story pretty well and doesn't spend a lot of time on exposition or explicitly telling us its themes or whatever. It's a main criticism that I see of it is that it is so artsy and so dialogue free for much of the time and just so atmospheric that it becomes boring, but I think it is what makes it so beautiful and also what allows the audience to kind of latch onto the things that they find compelling, either thematically or aesthetically, and kind of introduce their own meaning. And I also think that Herzog changes the ending in such a way that is really subversive and really kind of queer-coded and maybe a bit devilish as well. And so I think it takes bold swings while still remaining quite faithful to the original film. So I might elaborate more on this point in a future video and let me know if that's something you'd like to see, but the film seems to spend a lot of time exploring the guilt and shame that comes with women sort of embracing their own sexuality. There's a lot of discourse online happening right now where people seem to have different reads on whether or not this is a literal story of a woman sort of falling for and relinquishing to her groomer slash abuser, or if Orlok is more of a metaphorical character representing deviant sexuality in an extremely anti-feminist society. I definitely lean towards the latter, and I think that that's an interesting idea, but I do think that it becomes a little bit problematic in that what we're saying about the consequences of embracing one's own sexuality. Like, my friend who I went to see this with the second time, he brought up a really good point that I'm still thinking about, that rather than her embracing of her sexuality bringing upon this plague, it is actually the repression that brings upon the death and destruction. However, I think that this does fall apart a little bit when we think about the fact that her relationship to Orlok is kind of bookended by an underage assault and by her own sort of suicide and sacrifice. I don't know, I just think the implications of that are troubling, thematically speaking. So another read on this film that I want to explore a little bit, that I think was most succinctly and convincingly put forth by the Bloodhouse podcast, which I highly recommend, by the way, is that Orlok just serves as a stand-in sort of metaphor for depression and the death drive. That feels obvious, like it's kind of said explicitly, like that she suffers from melancholy and that like she sees herself with death in her visions and that she wants to embrace it and all this stuff. And so it's more so commenting on the death drive itself and the inherent eroticism of death and suicide, which is, you know, a bold thing, but also pretty standard in like gothic horror. And so that is the one that I think is the most thematically consistent throughout the film, but I just have to wonder, to what end? Like, what are we saying about that? What are we saying about depression? What are we saying about suicide? Like, as a person who has struggled with clinical depression and, you know, major depressive disorder and suicidality for most of my life, like, that didn't immediately connect with me, and I don't know that it really speaks to my experience, nor do I feel that it says anything particularly interesting about it. And obviously a film doesn't have to speak to my own personal experience in order for it to be good, but I feel like if we are touching on subjects that I have a lot of intimate experience with, or it doesn't connect with me on that level, like, that feels disappointing to me, or like it feels like something is missing there, I guess. And so I guess what I'm kind of driving at is that I think thematically the film is just simply very messy. It kind of feels like it wants to be about all of those things, but it can't really commit to any of them, especially not at the cost of deviating from the source material. That seems to be the paramount concern throughout this project. Another fair reading of this that is just straightforwardly reactionary is that it is about the destructive nature of female sexuality and how the cure, or the ideal worth dying for, is a cis-heteronormative romance. We sort of see that play out in the end as she sacrifices her life such that she can save her husband, who she frames as having saved her from the deviance of her relationship to Orlok. I don't know. I don't think that that's super great. And I don't think that that's the only valid read of it, but I do think that that is a valid read of it, right? I guess I would just really love for this to be bold enough to just fully rewrite the ending. Like, as I was watching it, I was like, oh, like, so she's not going to die, right? And Orlok's not going to die, and they're like actually going to embrace and like leave? And Nicholas Hoult is just going to be left destitute? Like, that's kind of what I was expecting. Like, let's do it, you know? But no. And I mean, there's precedent for that, right? Like, the original from 1922, it fully rewrites the ending of Dracula, even as it is existing as an adaptation of Dracula. As I already said, like, Herzog kind of has a queer continuation of vampiric sexuality added at the end of his adaptation. My last little stray note of criticism here is that I think it is extremely weird to have one of the heroes of the story, that being Willem Dafoe's character, talk about how we need to abandon scientific analysis of a literal plague and correctly blame it on a demon. I feel like you could get away with that when this script was first conceived, perhaps pre-COVID, but in a post-COVID world, it certainly feels icky, to say the least, to have a character just straightforwardly be like, you need to cut it out thinking that this is a plague brought upon by, you know, scientific means or like the natural world. Like, we need to go to supernatural explanations, and then he's vindicated, right? That didn't feel great, to be honest. Okay. In conclusion, I just wanted more from this, honestly. I wanted bolder choices, I wanted more thematic consistency, and I wanted some more deviance, or some more to differentiate it from previous adaptations. However, let's go ahead and end on a positive note, because I've done a lot of criticizing, and that's not the only thing I want to do here. Like, I do want to talk about the cultural moment that we're in and why I think it's important and actually very good. I am delighted at its success. Like right now, it's at like $135 million box office on a $50 million budget. This is his most successful film by far, and I think I just saw an article that it's in the top 100 or top 50 highest grossing horror films of all time. I think that's great. I think that's great for Robert Eggers, who is, again, still one of our most interesting and bold contemporary directors. And I think it's a great, like, gateway film to get the freaks into the weirder shit that I hope continues to get made and rediscovered. You know, I'm seeing some annoying posts that sort of position themselves as the gatekeeper of like, oh, you're not into the real shit if you're not into this movie. And those posts are annoying, but like, you're not a real pervert if you're like, this is for the real ones. You know, those posts are annoying, but I hope that this film serves as a gateway for those people to dig a little deeper and get a little weirder. And to that end, I want to recommend 5 films that I think are better and also go harder on these aspects in ways that I think are transgressive and interesting for people who liked this film. The first one is obviously Nosferatu the Vampire from 1979, directed by Werner Herzog. This is, to me, the singular best Dracula adaptation. One of my favorite films of all time. I think it's beautiful and erotic, and I love it. The next is the other one I've been talking about this whole time, Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. You know, to sell this film to you, I really just have to say, if you thought that the stuff in here was depraved and horny and weird, like, this is from the director of The Godfather, and this was made over 30 years ago, and there is a scene in which Dracula manifests himself as a kind of burly, huge werewolf, and and he, like, on an altar outside of Winona Ryder's house, he, like, rails the Lucy character missionary style and locks eyes with Winona Ryder as this happens. It's good stuff. The next I want to recommend is the one that I want to annoyingly reply to people with when they say that this is like the horniest shit, and that is the literal pornographic adaptation of Dracula from 1978 called Dracula Sucks, starring the singular Jamie Gillis. This is a film which, if you're not familiar with the golden age of hardcore films, is probably a good gateway if you're into horror films and gothic horror and all that type of stuff. The film does go pretty hard. Like, there is a lot of blood. It's not strictly erotic. It's also pretty gross, which, depending on the right freak, could also be erotic. The fourth film I want to recommend is Possession from 1981, starring Isabelle Adjani, and what I think is my favorite performance ever captured on film. I think that this film has gotten pretty mainstream as of late. It's not necessarily the hidden gem that it once was, but it's my second favorite film of all time, and Lily Rose Depp has been extremely explicit in that Ajani's performance in this was very influential on her. And I do think that it is this sort of histrionic, really physical performance done better. And I mean, it's also got some real freak shit in it too. And it is, again, my second favorite film of all time. So check that one out. The final one I want to recommend, this is a little bit different. It's not as maybe freaky as these other films are, but it is a really beautiful gothic romance horror film, Crimson Peak 2015 from Guillermo del Toro. I feel like this one was slept on at the time, and I think it is pretty ripe for a rediscovery now that the gothic is in the mainstream at the moment. So those are my 5 recommendations if you have seen Nosferatu and really enjoyed it and want more of this sort of thing. And like I said, for this film I landed on a 7 out of 10. Okay, that's it. That's the end of the review. I think I went a little long on this one, but I had a lot to say. I hope that you enjoyed this, and if you did, please go ahead and click the subscribe button. Plenty more in-depth analysis on the way. Click the like button, because it helps me in the algorithm, I suppose. Leave me comments to read, because it's lovely when I get to have a dialogue with people, as opposed to just me talking at people. Patreon, if you want to support me monetarily. If you want to support me non-monetarily, there are links in the description for my social media accounts. And until then, fix your hearts or die. Rest in peace, David Lynch. I'd like to thank our newest patron, Naren Santos. I'd also like to thank our accomplices, Anthony Listro, The Boogeyman's Closet, Carlin Cook, Dana Jordan Rothschild, Deanna Vave, The Disconnected, Dr. Jeff Butcher, Dustin Putman, George Strang, Julie Humphris, Nosferatu 1334, Phil Michelle, Sasha Bobashasaurus, and Stephen Perkins. If you'd like to be counted amongst their ranks, the link is in the description.